To the people on a plane on 9/11, what did your pilots tell you when they grounded all flights? I was flying from London to New York and diverted into Montreal. I told the passengers that there had been a security related event and that all US airspace had been closed down, requiring us to land at the nearest suitable airport. Jesus. To raised in the 80s me. That could only mean thermonuclear war. London to Chicago. Pilot told us there had been a major incident and US airspace was closed. Asked us not to talk or speculate with other passengers about the incident, to minimize panic. We turned our phones on as we taxied on landing in Montreal. Both towers were already down and phones were going crazy. People who had managed to get a call through were sobbing and trying to explain to those whose phones wouldn't connect what they had just heard. Absolute sense of disbelief all round, and it didn't really hit until I saw it on TV in the hotel. One thing we were told at the time by the pilot, which I never really looked into, was that the pilot was out of direct radio contact with ATC in both London and the US at the time. So they were talking to the plane behind them. Who was talking to the plane behind them? Who was talking to ATC somewhere? So they were getting garbled second or third hand information from multiple sources about planes crashing and hijackings and trying to inform their passengers while not being sure of the information they had received themselves. I always wondered if that was really how ground-to-air communications worked on long-haul flights. If so, it must have been a surreal and disorienting experience as a pilot to be told something so unbelievable without any immediate way to really verify it. I was on a United flight from Newark to Atlanta that morning. We were in the air when everything happened and were supposed to land about 9 o'clock. Just before landing they held us in a holding pattern in the air. At about 9:30 we landed. No announcements were made on the plane. Just as we got to the gate and people started turning their phones on, I hear phones start ringing everywhere. What happened? A plane hit what? At that point my phone started to ring as well. It was my wife wanting to make sure I wasn't on one of the planes. And she filled me in on what was known then. The pilot and cabin crew did not say anything about what happened. There was an eerie silence in the terminal. I did not see any TV screens. I went directly to the car rental company, got a car and started driving north. Back to NY. Listening to the radio as much as I could the whole way back. My father worked for Delta at the time as a supervisor in the airport. He was working a flight that was about to push back when everything shut down. He had the final paperwork for the flight crew and ran down to let them know they weren't going anywhere. ATC had just announced the shutdown to all aircraft on the ground. No details were given over the radio. Just that an incident had happened in Nick and all flights were grounded. He announced over the plane's PA that the flight was cancelled due to an unknown incident and everyone could retrieve their luggage in a few minutes. There were no TVs in the gate area back then, but a few of the shops and snack bars had TVs in the ticketing area. As people got near a TV the word spread. Everyone collected their bags and left the airport. Surprisingly there were no passengers screaming at the agents. No chaos. And from about 11 o'clock on the airport was deserted except for airline employees. Second hand, my parents were flying the morning of 9/11. I dropped them off at the airport and drove to work. First tower was hit as I pulled into the parking lot. Radio people thought it was just a fire at the tower. As I went into work and checked the news, it became clear a plane hit it. As I was on the phone with my buddy, the second plane hit on the live TV he was watching. That's when it was clear this was intentional. Started to tell my boss I needed to pick up my parents, but he cut me off and said, "Go." I called my parents as I ran to the car. The TVs at the gates had all been turned off and they announced no flights would be taking off. I raced to the airport, picked them up, and drove home to eerily empty roads and sky. I was on a plane from LA to Melbourne, with a stopover via Auckland. And 9/11 happened while we were in the air. Halfway through the flight, all the flight attendants got really nervous. And the pilot told us that due to a safety issue, the seatbelt sign was kept on throughout the flight, which we all found really confusing. When we landed in NZ, there were armed guards with machine guns to greet us, which is very out of the ordinary for New Zealand. The first reports the flight attendants gave us was that it was the Empire State Building that had been attacked. That was how confused initial reports were. We were luckily allowed to fly on to Melbourne. But after that all international flights were grounded for a few days. My dad was an armed high-ranking federal agent. He was flying from DC to Miami, I think. Definitely FL. He was woken up somewhere over Southern Virginia and asked to come to the cockpit. The pilots told him to guard the cockpit and that he was authorized to shoot. He spoke to someone confirming the authorization. He was given the jump seat next to the cockpit during landing, so he could see if anyone stood up. He told me later that the reason they were allowed to continue to Miami instead of putting down in the Carolinas was because he was on the plane. When he died in 2010, my mom showed me the piece of paper he had kept with his notes from that radio transmission. I think my older brother has them now. Side note: when he landed, he was met by the 3 guys he was flying down to meet with, and they all drove back overnight, getting back just in time to help oversee the search at the Pentagon. I've never seen him as shaken as the day he brought home a piece of the desk from his office. I flew from Sweden to Turkey. Before boarding the plane, I remember that everyone in the airport stood in silence watching the news on the different TV monitors in the airport. It was a really weird feeling that it was so silent in a usually hectic place. The flight went on as usual. The attack happened just before we checked into the airport. My stepdad was a pilot flying small private jets and was in the air when it happened. He said they just told him to land and had to go into the airport to find out why and what happened and go back to the plane to tell the passengers. Very late to the party. I wasn't on a flight then, but I know someone that was. Contrary to most replies in this thread, the pilot didn't say anything. While up in the air, they turned the plane around extremely slowly, so it wasn't noticeable to the passengers, or that was the idea. Then they landed at the airport they left from. I guess the turning around thing was to prevent any more terrorists from catching on. I'm surprised all the pilots announced they were turning around or landing due to security issues. My mother was at the Las Vegas airport waiting for her flight to board. She was sitting at a bank of slot machines and saw the breaking news on a TV tuned to CNN. She said that the people at the slot machines around her looked up for just a minute to watch the TV and promptly went back to playing the slots like nothing had happened. It made her very sad. I was due to catch a flight back to Nick on 10:30 AM of 9/11. Never made it to the airport. Rented a car the next day to drive back so I could get to my apartment, which was in the frozen zone below 14th Street. 2 friends of mine who were sisters were departing on 2 different international flights that morning. One departed. The other didn't. It was several hours before they could reach each other to confirm that neither of them had been on the affected flights. Father-in-law was a rare hostie on a flight from Sydney to LA. They initially told the pilot to turn around and go to Hawaii as mainland US airspace was closed. Pilot told them they didn't have enough fuel and air traffic control told him to put it in the sea then. Thankfully the situation was controlled pretty quickly and the plane did eventually land in LA after some circling. I was still a toddler, but my dad was on a flight from England to Nick and luckily wasn't too long after takeoff they redirected them to land. But my mom had the worst panic attack ever and must have called my dad 100 times because there was no info on what planes crashed and she knew he was in the air at the time. My wife was flying Paris. Nick, the pilot, first came on the PA and said bombs were being dropped on US soil. Airspace was closed and they were diverting to Halifax because they didn't have enough fuel to return to Paris. Then they came on and said Halifax was closed and they would have to return to France. Not enough fuel? The plane landed in Brest, on the west coast of France. No clue how much fuel the plane was left with. My wife was put up in a very nice hotel with the rest of the business class passengers and was stuck for 4 very surreal days in Paris. There was a doctor on board who was flying to Nick to do an organ transplant. He was able to access a fax machine in the cockpit to tell the medical team in Nick that he wouldn't make it and they should halt the organ harvest from the donor. Fascinating. My mom wasn't told anything except that they had to land immediately. She was flying back from Taiwan and was closest to Hawaii. So they turned around and landed at Hawaii. It was a work trip, so they covered her hotel and all expenses for a week. She said it was horrible what happened, but a really nice vacation. Not me, but my mom, who was and still is a flight attendant. She was working a flight from DFW Boss that morning. They were approaching the northeast when they were diverted to Akron. Oh. I'm not sure what she was specifically told, but I know they knew something was up. Their flight communications are even included in transcripts from that day. By that time both towers had been hit and they were headed west over Pennsylvania to land. My mom said they were all on edge, not really comprehending the severity of the situation and wondering whether they might be hijacked themselves. They were communicating with Cleveland on the ground when the hijacking of United 93 began over Western PA. So there was communication between both flights and ground trying to confirm that the screaming etc they heard on the frequency was really a hijacking. Apparently United 93 was right behind them, and my mom says the crew was back and forth up in the cockpit and in the galley looking out the windows trying to see the plane, while trying not to scare passengers. I was flying from Atlanta to Denver. Our flight was forced to land in Tulsa. Okay. We were told that there was a terrorist attack in NY and that our aircraft had been ordered to land. The pilot did not mention that all aircraft had been ordered to land. As the only brown person on board, I thought, great. They must think that I am a suspect and now we have to land. Once we landed and I saw all the planes jamming the tarmac, I realized that it was something really big.